Really pleased to be here, and thank you to Charlotte and the team for the invitation. If any of you have been around in the sector as long as I have, and certainly been working in the sector of Maidstone as long as I have, and you're sat there thinking, I recognise him but he had more hair, that's because about 7 years ago Bridget brought me down here to do some training for the sector at Maidstone, which was fantastic, and I was amazed at how easily I was able to remember the route from the station to the venue after not being in Maidstone for 7 years afterwards. Charlotte says my name's Rob. I am here really to talk about something called Bridging the Gap, which I'll talk a little bit more about in a moment, but a little bit about who I am. I've worked in and around the voluntary sector and the volunteering sector since about 1994. Held kind of strategic development roles for volunteer programs in a number of national charities, including 6 years particularly focusing on the fundraising side of things. And for 6 years up until the end of April, I was working at Volunteering England, most of those as one of the directors of Volunteering England. And I am the living embodiment of the cuts, as I'm sure others of you in the room are, as I was unfortunate enough to lose my job at that point. So I sold myself to the devil, went to work in the private sector and set my own business up. And I was saying to somebody earlier on, it's quite strange now actually, I find myself working as a private sector consultant with a predominantly voluntary sector customer base at the same time as being a chair of governors in a school, which is a public sector. So I've got 2 legs firmly in 3 sectors. I'm not quite sure how I manage that on a day-to-day basis. So I now run Rob Jackson Consulting, which provides kind of training and support and consultancy and speaking services to the sector nationally and internationally, and thankfully managed to spend a lot more time at home, which means I can balance my duties as chair of governors in a local primary school, in which I have learned more about VAT in school kitchens than I think I ever possibly cared to know. What I'm going to talk about is bridging the gap, so I'm going to spend about 25 minutes talking about this report from Canada called Bridging the Gap, and we're going to make sure that you've got copies of the slides available electronically afterwards for today, so that all the resources that I mentioned you'll be able to kind of access. But my contact details are on the final slide, so if there's anything that I mentioned that you subsequently can't find or you've got questions about, please don't hesitate to get in touch. And then we'll do some Q&A during the panel discussion later on, because I'm very aware I'm standing between you and a cup of coffee. And if you're feeling desperate, I've been up since 5 o'clock this morning, so I'm pretty keen to get a coffee as well. So Bridging the Gap, just quick show of hands, how many people have come across the report Bridging the Gap so far this year? Okay, you can go to sleep for the next 25 minutes. Bridging the Gap was a report published by Volunteering Canada, Volunteer Canada, in about February, March of this year, and predominantly the primary research was done in Canada, but there was a huge literature review, a piece of secondary research done that was global in scope, and so pulled in a number of things from here, from organisations like the Institute for Volunteering Research and NCVO as well, really looking at, is there a gap between what people want from volunteering nowadays and what organisations are offering in terms of opportunities, and if there is, how do we meet that gap? Now, by virtue of the fact they published a report called Bridging the Gap, I think it's fairly safe to say that they did identify a gap. So what I'm going to predominantly talk about today is some of the kind of top line things from that. What were some of the issues that they highlighted, etc., etc. What I would say is the full report, and the full report runs to about 200 pages, although there's a very accessible executive summary of about 20 or 30 pages, looks in particular detail at 4 groups: young people, families, baby boomers, and employer-supported volunteers as well. I'm not going to go into the detail of those 4, so if you work particularly with those groups, you're interested in engaging those groups as volunteers, I would very much recommend that you get hold of a copy of the research and have a look at it. So the 4 things that I'm going to focus on today are the kind of 4 top-line findings. The first was the legacy of Uber volunteers, about which more in a moment. The potential of past volunteers, the gaps and why they exist, and how we can respond, what we can do about those gaps. Now, if you've seen some of the research from the Third Sector Research Centre, you may well be familiar with this. It was a bit of a kind of highlight finding that was put out at the end of the summer this year. The point about the Uber volunteer that they made in Canada, and I've seen it certainly be true in the US and Australia and the UK as well, is that we are very reliant upon a very small pool, comparatively, of people to provide the vast majority of the volunteering that we rely upon in this country at any one time. And this research, which was done by the Third Sector Research Centre and pulled out in earlier publications, Pathways Through Participation, which I would absolutely endorse as a very good report, well worth having a look at, found that 31% of the adult population of this country provide almost 90% of the volunteer hours, and 8% of the adult population provide almost half of the volunteer hours. And those proportions are predominantly the traditional volunteer base. So when you ask people what they think of as volunteers, it is the kind of people you would expect, really. And one of the defining characteristics, I won't go into all of them because you can sometimes offend people with the stereotyping that comes with that, but one of the defining characteristics of that group of people is their age, and the fact that they are largely ageing in place, and where we are seeing a decline in some of that volunteering is because, sadly, quite literally, some of those people are dying out. What is also significant about those characteristics is those older people have very different characteristics, as we'll see, and very different motivations from the older people that are coming behind them in the baby boomer generation. So, as one person, when I was speaking to them about this, said, well, it's fantastic, you're telling us that all the volunteers in future are going to be older people because of the population shift. Yes, they are, potentially, but they're going to want very different things from what you're offering your volunteers at the moment. The other thing that they found was the potential of past volunteers, which seems kind of a bit of a no-brainer, really, which was that some of the best potential for getting people to volunteer who weren't currently volunteers were those who had been volunteers in the past, those who had been actively involved in volunteering and for whatever reason had stopped. This data is from Helping Out, which was the last national survey of volunteering back in 2007. There were ones prior to that in 97, 91 and 1981. And they provide over the kind of 20-30 year period a degree of kind of trend analysis in how volunteering's changed. Most of our data in the last 10 years, which is where you'll see figures stated in the sector press about volunteering plateauing, comes from the citizenship survey, which the government in their infinite wisdom have decided to cease. Probably because it provides the most reliable evidence as to whether or not the big society is actually working. And so that now no longer exists. We've had the last set of data from that, and that shows that the levels of volunteering are pretty much static and haven't changed much over the last 10 years. But the breakdown from 2007 lets us look into this. So they absolutely said, in bridging the gap, that the most promising opportunity to engage more volunteers is amongst past volunteers, people who have been volunteering previously. But that in order to do that, we really need to understand and address their issues as to why they stopped volunteering. Sometimes that can be quite simply they moved away, but quite often it's because their motivations, their interests changed over time, and the organisations didn't adapt their offer to meet that, and so the person stopped volunteering with them. We'll come back to that thing in a few minutes' time. So in the UK data, 1 in 5, so 20% of people had volunteered, but now weren't volunteering. And the changes in personal circumstances, broader topic as that is, was absolutely the top reason. Quite often that was due to changing home, moving house or work circumstances, which were identified by 41% of respondents. The other common reasons for people stopping volunteering was because the activity was no longer relevant, for example their motivations had shifted. Health problems or old age, which goes back to that point I was making earlier about the reliance on the traditional core, and moving away from the area, just simply not being in the same place and able to volunteer with the organisations. But interestingly, 54% of non-volunteers, so that includes past volunteers and people who had never volunteered, would like to volunteer. And all the research commonly says the most common reason why people don't volunteer is because somebody never asked them. And that word of mouth kind of remains a high thing. It'd be interesting, maybe I don't know what you do, and we can explore this in conversation later on or in the question and answers about what you do in your organisations at the moment to understand the reasons why people leave you as a volunteer, and whether there are any trends coming through in that and issues that can kind of help you think about, well, how do I adapt our offer? How do we change the way that we do things in order to be able to bring people in? Do we really understand why people are leaving us? So the gaps. What were the main gaps that came up in the research that people found? Remember, these are gaps between what people who are wanting to volunteer want from their volunteering and what organisations commonly are offering. The first one was that people want to volunteer in groups. They want to volunteer together with others, either in a group of people already pre-existing that wants to come and do something for you, or with other people that they haven't met before, but there are a few opportunities on offer. There's an extended version of this presentation that I do where I include a slide from NFP Synergy, Joe Saxton's research think tank, which shows the significant growth in single-person households over the last 30-odd years, and the way that that is projected to grow in the future against a decline in households of more than 2 people. And one of the points that Joe makes regularly is that kind of more isolationist thing. We don't have those social contacts anymore. People want that from their volunteering. They don't want to come in and be on their own and do something on their own. They want group activities. And there's an interesting debate going on at the moment on the UK VPNs, which is the email discussion group I run about family volunteering, which is quite big in the States and quite big in Canada and some of the other countries as well. It hasn't really taken off over here, possibly because of the health and safety bit. The idea of young people coming in and helping out on environmental projects and giving 5-year-olds chainsaws seems to be the kind of thing. I wouldn't give my 9-year-old a chainsaw, not even a toy one. So that seems to have kind of got in the way of it. But those group activities absolutely came out as a top thing that people wanted and organisations didn't offer. The fact that people come with skills to volunteer, but they don't always want to do it. You know, I have a friend who is an accountant. He loves being an accountant, good on him. The last thing that he wants to do when he finishes work is be your honorary treasurer. Not all accountants are like that, some of them want to do that. He may have a particular passion for web design and be the ideal person to design you a new website as a volunteer. But most of the time, the research is finding that if somebody had that skill, that's what they wanted. That's what the organisation wanted to offer them. We have very clearly defined volunteer roles, and please don't hear anything I'm about to say as an argument against having role profiles or job descriptions or whatever you want to call them for volunteers. And certainly in the kind of years that I've been working in the sector, that's become far more common as it's kind of become more professionalised, more HR-driven, etc. around volunteer management. What they found was that volunteers increasingly want to have more of a say over how their work is done. I've seen this in organisations where they recruit somebody in with a particular skill or expertise that they know they don't have in the organisation, and then they proceed to tell that person how to do the job, when they've already admitted they don't have the knowledge in the organisation to do it. And think again, the baby boomer generation, of which I'm sure there are many of you in the room, who've, compared to any other generation beforehand, have changed the world in radical ways, have got far more professional experience in many ways than other generations beforehand. They are going to want to be able to use those skills and experiences and make their own decisions about how the volunteer work is done, not just be told by us what they have to do all the time. This is what the research was finding. This one will be familiar to anybody in the room who is involved in any project that involves volunteers. We all want longer-term volunteers. Fantastic. The reality is people don't want to commit, at least initially, to a long-term, time-intensive relationship for volunteering. Somebody said to me earlier on, this is very good, but we just want to know how to get on and do the bread and butter. Well, the reason why the bread and butter is getting difficult is because people aren't adapting to the fact that people want very different volunteering. We live increasingly time-complex and time-pressurised lives, and that's why people want to adapt, certainly change initially. Their initial commitment wants to be much more light touch than I'll volunteer to help you out for the next 20 years. And we focus on our own needs very often without really thinking about the goals that the volunteers want. And we all know that a really well-managed volunteer programme, when it works well, is because the volunteers' needs, the organisation's needs, and where appropriate beneficiaries' needs are being met, and that thing's in balance. So a little bit more about why some of those gaps exist. And one of the things that they found in the research was that, unsurprisingly, and you will all have had personal experience of this because you've all been on the planet for more than about 5 minutes, that our motivations, availabilities and interests change during our lives. Yet quite quite often the determination of what somebody's motivations are is down to a 15-minute interview when that person starts volunteering. And if your experience is anything like mine, normally people will tell you what they think you want to hear, rather than their own kind of particular passions around volunteering and why they want to do it. And we don't really do a great deal about understanding how those motivations change over time, and really understanding how that affects their interest, their availability to volunteer. Whilst pathways through participation is great, and it is one of the most practical things, the subject of motivation of volunteers is possibly the most over-researched subject in the voluntary sector, and it tells us very, very little, actually, that makes much of a practical difference. That's why pathways stand out as something that's really, really useful. That volunteering is a two-way relationship, so this is that point about holding things in balance in terms of needs and motivations. I don't think volunteering has ever been purely altruistic. Nobody's ever volunteered purely for selfless reasons. I think the point is it's now entirely more acceptable for you to come to a volunteering relationship and say, I want skills development, or I want whatever it is out of my volunteering. Part of what they were finding in the research was that there was a degree of slowness to respond to that, which is why some of those gaps existed. That skills transfer and development is important. I think this is going to be absolutely fascinating. We are understandably driven at the moment by concerns around increased volunteer involvement alongside cuts, with debates around job substitution, job displacement, job replacement. The reality is, with the baby boomer generation who are starting to hit retirement age this year and will significantly shift the population balance in this country, we have a generation of people, as I said earlier, with professional skills like we've never dreamed of beforehand, who can come in and do things that we might never have been able to get volunteers to do before. They are quite often very passionate about doing that, and if we limit ourselves purely by kind of narrow-mindedness, dare I say it, around the cuts agenda or whatever else, then we risk missing a major opportunity to engage people and really revolutionise the way that our organisations go about doing things. That time is our most valuable resource. Hands up, anybody in the room who has more than 24 hours available to them in a given day? Hands up, anybody in the room who wishes they had more than 24 hours available to them in a given day? Come on, it's all of you really. You know, yes, cash is hard to come by these days. Yes, funding is hard to come by. Time is far more hard to come by because of the pressures of the lives that we all live. You know, it's just far more complicated than ever before. Look at the outcry from people earlier this week when their Blackberries stopped working. As my youngest son said, has your Blackberry run out of juice, Daddy? And it's amazing that we haven't seen the headline, or at least I haven't seen it, Blackberry crumble. That was the other one that came out. In other words, today's volunteers are different. People who want to volunteer now are different from people who wanted to volunteer 10, 15, 20 years ago. I'm generalising massively, I realise that. But that's just the plain truth of things. Yet most organisations still offer things and still manage their volunteer programmes as if we were living in the 1960s, 70s and early 80s. We've got to change. There isn't a shortage of volunteers. It's interesting to see that there's a 49% increase, and I know from working with Charlotte when I was a volunteer in England, nationally that number was significantly higher. The problem is that the number of people inquiring about volunteering is massively up. The number of people who actually volunteer is not massively up. And that should be waking us up to the fact what we're offering is not attractive to these people. And certainly when it comes to the baby boomer generation, if they don't find what you're offering attractive, they'll go up and set up their own organisations, meeting the social needs that you're there to create, you're there to meet, and potentially put you out of business in the future. You thought this was going to be a nice encouragement. So how can we respond? Okay, things are changing, the world's changing, how can we respond to that? That's really the core thing. The Bridging the Gap report came up with just 3 points which I'll expand upon in a second around an optimal formula to build organisational capacity to engage, strategically engage volunteers, and that's really the essence of it. How can we make it possible to engage more volunteers more effectively in our organisations? So the first one was to design specific set roles and be open to volunteers determining the scope of what they can offer. So by all means have an idea about what you want your volunteers to do, that's absolutely right and proper. But in those roles, leave some wriggle room for them to determine how best to go about it, and be open to the fact that somebody may walk through your front door on Monday morning with a set of skills that you never dreamed somebody would provide, and they could be a fantastic volunteer for you. Match skills to the needs of the organisation, but don't assume that everybody wants to use the skills related to their trade or their profession or whatever else that they do. So the lesson from this is really to spend a lot more time up front with people, understanding their skills, their interests, their passions, and how those could be put to best use within the organisation. And be well organised, but not too bureaucratic. There's lots that's been good about the development of volunteer management profession over the last 20 years. One of the downsides of it is that we have become far more process-driven. Volunteer management increasingly these days, certainly in larger organisations, is about managing processes, and it forgets that actually the whole point of this is about people. And if you read the really more cutting-edge stuff, actually it doesn't get referred to as volunteer management anymore, and quite rightly so. It's about leadership, it's about engagement, it's about participation, not about managing. As one person said, processes don't work, people do, and that's the key bit. Really excellent. So how can we respond? The first one goes back to the point I was making earlier on about the whole kind of job substitution agenda. I think we really need to radically rethink about how we involve people to achieve our mission as voluntary organisations. One of the really frustrating things for me is seeing so much written in the sector press at the moment from leaders in the sector about how the kind of subtext to which is that we need to start limiting our ambition because we're not getting the money to do the work anymore. You know, that's ridiculous. That's, you know, if that was the mindset that most of our organisations have had when the volunteers first came together to create them, none of us would be here in the first place. We need to radically rethink, okay, we haven't got the cash, how can we engage other resources to do that? I also think it's going to be really interesting, that whole baby boom thing. I think it will not be long before we start to see organisations created or organisations changed, where the predominant model of the specialist, technical, professional skill is provided by volunteers with a small number of paid staff supporting them. And in fact, there may be organisations like that in the room at the moment. That is, I think, going to be a radical shift in the way that we do things in future. And I'm happy to come back in 7 years' time and be proved wrong. All right. We absolutely need to focus more on what needs doing than on how and when it is done. This is the thing about the roles that we give people. We need to clearly articulate to people what we want to achieve, and then let them use their skills and talents and abilities in groups of people increasingly, because remember, go back to that, to actually get on and do the work. We clearly need to be more flexible and provide much greater choice. One of my theories about the way that organisations will succeed in keeping volunteers, retaining volunteers in future, is because they're more willing to let them go than anybody else. Because I know if you're prepared to let me walk away for a short period of time, I'm more likely to come back to you in the future because I think you'll let me do that again. If you try desperately to hang on to me, I'll walk away and I'll never come back. The choice one is really, really interesting. There's a lot that Joe Saxton talks about this in the way that people in the public are used to, you and I are used to choice, and yet most of what is offered in volunteering is quite a limiting choice. To give you an example, when I was a kid growing up in the 1970s, we had 3 channels of TV to choose from. Nowadays, anybody want to take a guess at how many TV channels are available in the UK? 526. That is just in a very, very short period of time. One of my favourite ones from Joe is if you used to go into a cafe and the choice that you were faced with was tea or coffee. You went into an average branch of Starbucks, and I'm sure you've got a Starbucks in Maidstone. You must have Starbucks in Maidstone. You don't? Oh, good on you. Not a degree. If you had a Starbucks, if you walked into the average branch of Starbucks and you ordered a different drink every day, it would take you 80 years to get through all the various different combinations of drinks that are available in an average branch of Starbucks. That's the level of choice that people are used to, and we wonder why they get suspicious when they see that we have one volunteer role. We need to provide opportunities for online engagement. We're going to have some stuff about online later on. Loads of potential for online engagement. I've been involved in volunteering projects where, through my own volunteering, where I will complete a piece of work, email it to a colleague in Australia, go to bed, they will work on it whilst I'm asleep, it will come back to me when I wake up in the morning, and we can literally work 24 hours a day between us to do some of that. The slight note of caution that comes with that, if anybody's ever read any of the stuff that I've written on this, either in the sector or in my own blog, is I think we need to be slightly cautious of technology being the saviour of volunteering. There is a lot spoken at the moment about micro-volunteering, the idea that when you're waiting for a train for 5 minutes, you can log in through your iPhone or your BlackBerry when it's working and do volunteering. Loads of potential in there, but it needs to come with a bit of a caution. You know, we're investing lots of money, government are investing lots of money in these things without much evidence that it's really making much of a difference. So there's lots of, and it's not new. Online volunteering has been going on for 20 or 30 years, as long as the internet's been there. Online volunteering has been happening. So loads of potential, but we need to be slightly cautious. We really need to build meaningful relationships with volunteers, professional relationships. Charlotte was talking earlier on about the importance of kind of engaging with people. When she was talking about pathways of participation, we absolutely need to do that. We need to take time with people. We need to get volunteering back to being more about the people than it is about managing the processes. Again, don't hear me, I'm not saying get rid of all your policies, I'm just saying get the thing in balance much more effectively. And absolutely, we need to invest far more time, effort and money in support for volunteering and for the engagement of volunteers. And I think one of the sad things that we're seeing in the recession is the amount of money that is being ploughed into fundraising by the sector when there is no decreasing pool compared to the amount of money that's being put into volunteering in the sector. And the huge potential, untapped potential that's there, and yet the capacity of organisations to really build on that is minimal. Maybe that's something we can talk about later on. So useful reading and resources. Just so you know, I've just not made up the last half hour. First of all, if you haven't read it yet, I would absolutely encourage you to read The 21st Century Volunteer by NFP Synergy. It's back from about 2005 now, but like most of these things, scarily relevant because not many of us have actually done massive amounts about what those kind of reports say. Bridging the Gap from Volunteer Canada. If you struggle to get to sleep at night, absolutely read the full 200-page report. If not, and you're like me and you've not got a great amount of time, probably the exec summary is the one to go for. Participation Trends, Facts and Figures was a kind of almanac that NCVO published earlier on this year. It's got a lot of data in there. Pathways to participation, I would absolutely add to that. And I've done, shameless plug, on my blog there is a fairly recent article unpacking what Pathways Through Participation means for people working with volunteers. And the link to the blog will be up in a minute. So if you don't have the time to read the whole report, it's well worth going in and just having a look at that, or indeed their own summary on volunteering. Helping Out, a national survey of volunteering and charitable giving. Again, you can just type into Google or your search engine of choice and download it for free. Definitely, if you want to take a message back from this to your organisation that we need to invest more in support for volunteer engagement, Volunteering England's Value Volunteer Management campaign, which we ran for about 18 months up until the end of March. Loads of resources on there for chief execs, directors, trustees, about their role in engaging and supporting volunteers, and also equipping volunteer managers to be able to do some of that as well. Those are my contact details, which hopefully you can see clearly. By all means, ask questions over coffee, ask questions in the Q&A later on. I'm here all day, so feel free to kind of call me and quiz me on anything. But if afterwards you can't get hold of any of those things, or you just want to get in touch, or you just want to go and have a look at the blog, that's the information you need. 2 minutes.